The day Hollywood learned what heroes really look like. They tell you that Hollywood is a dream factory. They sell you the illusion that the silver screen is where magic happens, where good conquers evil, where the hero always rides off into the sunset with honor intact. But anyone who spent 5 minutes behind the curtain knows the truth. Hollywood in the 1950s was a machine. It chewed up people and spit them out. It valued profits over people, schedules over souls, and the show always had to go on. Unless you were John Wayne and Dean Martin. This is the story of the day that two of the biggest stars in the world looked at that machine, looked at a man bleeding out his future on a dusty Western street, and said one word that changed everything. Stop. It was 1958, and the set of Rio Bravo should have been just another Western production. Director Howard Hawks had assembled a powerhouse cast. John Wayne was at the absolute peak of his powers. The Duke himself, box office gold with a face carved from granite, and a presence that could fill a cinemascope frame all by itself. Dean Martin was making the leap from crooner to serious actor, proving he was more than just a funny drunk from his nightclub act. Together with Walter Brennan, Ricky Nelson, and Angie Dickinson, they were creating what would become one of the greatest westerns ever made. But on one particular afternoon in old Tucson, Arizona, where the desert sun beat down like a hammer and the dust got into everything, the cameras weren't rolling, the crew wasn't working, the director wasn't directing, because John Wayne and Dean Martin had made a decision that would echo through Hollywood history and prove that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do has nothing to do with what's written in a script. This is the story of what happened when a stuntman's life hung in a balance and two legends chose humanity over Hollywood. This is the story of a day Rio Bravo stopped, and why what happened next mattered more than any movie ever could. The titans who stood together. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you need to understand who these men were in 1958. John Wayne wasn't just a movie star. He was America. He was the embodiment of every value the country claimed to hold dear: courage, integrity, loyalty, and an unshakable moral compass. He'd been making movies for nearly 30 years by the time Rio Bravo came around. He'd survived the transition from silent films to talkies, from B-westerns to A-list productions, from young leading man to American icon. But here's what the fan magazines didn't tell you. Behind that tough guy persona, behind the swagger and the drawl, and that distinctive walk that became his trademark, Wayne ran his sets with an iron code of honor. He'd started as a prop boy, hauling equipment, and learning the business from the ground up. He knew every job on a film set, because he'd done most of them. He knew the names of the grips, the gaffers, the wranglers. He remembered the guy who brought him coffee, and the kid who held the reflector. And he never, ever forgot that making movies was dangerous work. Wayne had a reputation. If you worked hard, if you showed up on time, if you gave him your best, he'd go to war for you. He'd fight the studio, fight the producers, fight anyone who tried to treat his crew like disposable parts in the Hollywood machine. He commanded loyalty because he gave it first. When John Wayne shook your hand and looked you in the eye, you knew you had a friend for life. Dean Martin was a different story, but no less remarkable. In 1958, he was in the middle of reinventing himself. The partnership with Jerry Lewis had exploded in a bitter, public split. The entertainment world had written Dean off as a straight man, the pretty face, the guy who couldn't carry a picture without the manic energy of his former partner. They'd underestimated him completely. Dean Martin was one of the smartest men in show business, and he hid behind that lazy, couldn't care less demeanor. He watched, he listened, he learned. And when Howard Hawks offered him the role of dude in Rio Bravo, the alcoholic deputy trying to regain his dignity, Dean saw his chance to prove he was a serious actor. He prepared for that role like a method actor, studying every gesture, every hesitation, every moment of shame and redemption his character would experience. But more importantly for this story, Dean had never forgotten where he came from. Born Dino Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of an Italian immigrant barber, he'd grown up watching his father work 12-hour days for pennies. He'd worked as a steel mill laborer, a bootlegger, a car dealer, and a boxer before making it in show business. He knew what it meant to put your body on the line for a paycheck. He knew what it meant when the money stopped coming in and the rent was due. When Wayne and Martin came together on Rio Bravo, they recognized something in each other. Despite their different backgrounds, despite their different styles, they shared a fundamental decency. They both believed that how you treated people when the cameras weren't rolling mattered more than anything you did when they were. They became genuine friends during that production, and that friendship will be tested in the most profound way possible. The invisible men who risked everything. Here's something they don't teach you in film school. Every time you watch a Western from the 1950s, every time you see a cowboy leap from a racing horse, every time you watch a man tumble down a staircase, or crash through a window, or take a punch that sends him flying across the saloon, you're watching someone risk their life for $50 a stunt. The stuntmen of old Hollywood were the invisible warriors of cinema. They were the reason the movies looked real, felt real, made your heart race and your palms sweat. But they were also the most expendable people on any set. They had no union protecting them, no safety regulations beyond try not to die, and no guarantee of work tomorrow if they got hurt today. If a stunt went wrong, if bones broke or ligaments tore, the production would simply call another stuntman. There was always another guy willing to take the risk. The math was brutal and simple. A stuntman could make decent money if he worked constantly and never got injured. But the moment he went down, the moment he couldn't perform, he became a financial liability. The studios didn't pay for medical care beyond the bare minimum legally required. They didn't compensate for lost wages. They didn't help with rehabilitation. You healed up on your own dime. And if you couldn't come back at 100%, there were 10 hungry young cowboys ready to take your spot. The really dangerous stuff paid more, of course. High falls, car crashes, fire stunts. These were premium gigs. But they were also the ones that ended careers and sometimes lives. The stunt community was tight-knit because they had to be. They looked out for each other, shared techniques, warned each other about directors who took unnecessary risks or coordinators who cut corners. By the end of the day, when the call came for a dangerous gag, someone had to say yes. Someone had to roll the dice. Because if you said no, if you showed fear, you'd never work again. This was the world Bob Morgan lived in, and it was a world that nearly killed him. The man who fell from grace. Bob Morgan was a Hollywood stuntman. By 1958, he'd been throwing himself off horses, crashing through doors, and taking punches to the cameras for nearly 20 years. He was good at his job, really good. He had the timing, the body control, and most importantly, the nerve to do the stunts that made other professionals nervous. His face wasn't famous, but his work was in 100 movies you've probably seen. Morgan was married to actress Yvonne DiCarlo, who was starring as Lily Munster on television at the time. They had 2 young boys at home. Bob was a breadwinner, the steady paycheck that kept the family secure while his wife's career went up and down with the unpredictable tides of Hollywood fortune. He couldn't afford to turn down work. He couldn't afford to be careful. He had to be fearless, because fearless stuntmen were the ones who got called back. When the call came for Rio Bravo, Bob Morgan signed on immediately. It was a major production with major stars, the kind of gig that could lead to more work, better connections, and a steady stream of income. The stunts were typical Western fare. Horse falls, fistfights, the occasional dive through a window. Nothing Bob hadn't done 100 times before. But there was one gag that made him uneasy. The script called for a scene where a character gets dragged by a horse through the dusty streets of the fictional town. It was a classic Western stunt, the kind of thing that looked spectacular on screen, but required perfect timing and coordination. The stuntman would be rigged with a breakaway harness attached to the saddle. The horse would bolt, drag the man for a specific distance, and then the harness would release, allowing the stuntman to tumble free before any real damage occurred. In theory, it was safe. In practice, it was one of the most dangerous stunts in the Western playbook. Everything had to go right. The harness had to hold until the exact moment it needed to release. The horse had to run the planned route. The stuntman had to protect his head and vital organs while being dragged across ground that was as hard as concrete. And everyone involved had to execute their part perfectly, because there were no second chances when you were bouncing along at 20 miles per hour with half a ton of horse pulling you. Bob Morgan voiced his concerns to the stunt coordinator. The ground was harder than usual. The dust was thick, making visibility poor. The horse seemed skittish. But the schedule was tight, the light was perfect, and the director wanted the shot today. So Bob did what stuntmen always did. He pushed down the fear, checked his equipment one more time, and nodded to the assistant director. The cameras rolled. The horse bolted, and everything went wrong. The harness didn't release when it was supposed to. Bob Morgan was dragged twice the planned distance, his body slamming against rocks and ruts in the road that hadn't been cleared. When the harness finally broke free, he tumbled like a rag doll, his left leg twisted at an angle that made everyone on set go silent. He tried to stand and collapsed immediately, his leg shattered in multiple places, his knee destroyed, his ankle hanging loose. The set medic came running. The stunt coordinator went pale. The assistant director started yelling about getting an ambulance, and Bob Morgan lay in the dust, looking up at the Arizona sky, knowing with absolute certainty that his career was over. At 39 years old, with a wife and 2 kids depending on him, he'd just taken his last fall. But he was wrong about one thing, because standing over him, blocking out the sun like a monolith, was John Wayne. And behind Wayne, moving fast with genuine fear in his eyes, was Dean Martin. And what happened next would change Bob Morgan's life in ways he never could have imagined. The moment everything changed. John Wayne didn't wait for the director to call cut. He didn't wait for the assistant director to assess the situation. He didn't wait for anyone to tell him what to do. He simply walked into frame, dropped to one knee beside Bob Morgan, and said in that unmistakable voice, "Don't move, son. We've got you." Dean Martin was right behind him, already shrugging off his costume coat to make a pillow for Morgan's head. The set medic was trying to assess the damage, but Wayne waved him back. "Get a real ambulance here now. Not the studio ambulance, a real one from town. And call ahead to the hospital. Tell them we're bringing in a priority patient and money is no object. You got that?" The assistant director, clipboard in hand, made the mistake of saying, "Duke, we need to know if we can get the shot again before we lose the light." The look John Wayne gave that man could have melted steel. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more final. "Son," Wayne said quietly, "if you say one more word about that camera while this man is lie here broken, I'm going to personally throw you off the set. And if I ever hear you got another job in this town, I'm going to make it my mission to see that you lose it. Do we understand each other?" The assistant director went white and backed away. Dean Martin was talking softly to Bob Morgan, keeping him calm, telling him jokes, keeping his mind off the pain. "Hey, Bobby, you know what the difference is between a stuntman and a drunk? A drunk falls down on purpose and gets paid nothing. You're clearly doing it wrong." Morgan, through gritted teeth, managed a weak laugh. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. It felt like hours. During that time, Wayne and Martin never left Morgan's side. They kept him talking, kept him conscious, kept him from going into shock. When the paramedics started to load him onto the stretcher, Wayne stopped them. "Where are you taking him?" "St. Mary's, sir. It's the closest." "No, you're taking him to Tucson Medical Center. They've got the best orthopedic surgeons in Arizona. I've already called ahead. They're expecting him." "Sir, that's 40 miles. Then you better drive fast. And carefully. Dean, you ride with him. I'm going to follow in my car." Dean Martin climbed into the ambulance without hesitation. And that's when Wayne did something that sent shockwaves through the entire production. He turned to Howard Hawks, the director, and said, "We're done for the day. Send everyone home." Hawks, one of the most powerful directors in Hollywood, started to protest. "Duke, we got 5 more setups to shoot. We're already behind schedule." The studio. "Howard," Wayne interrupted, and his voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I'm not asking. I'm telling. We're not shooting another frame today. We're not shooting tomorrow. We're not shooting until I know that Bob Morgan is going to be okay, that his family is taken care of, and that he knows he's not going to lose everything because of this. If Warner Brothers has a problem with that, they can call me directly. But I promise you, if they push me on this, I'll walk off this picture, and they can explain to their stockholders why they lost their biggest star and their biggest production of the year." The silence on that set was absolute. In 1958, You didn't threaten to walk away from a major studio production. You didn't halt filming for a stuntman. You just didn't. The studios owned you. The contracts bound you. The machine was bigger than any one person, even John Wayne. Except John Wayne had just proven that wrong. Hawks, to his eternal credit, nodded slowly. All right, Duke, we shut down. I'll handle the studio. And just like that, Rio Bravo stopped. What they did that nobody saw. What happened next didn't make the trade papers. It didn't appear in the gossip columns. There were no photographers present to capture it for the fan magazines. This part of the story only came out years later, when Bob Morgan finally felt comfortable talking about it, and even then he did so with tears in his eyes. John Wayne and Dean Martin went to Tucson Medical Center and stayed there. Not for an hour, not for an afternoon. They stayed for 2 days while Bob Morgan underwent surgery after surgery to try to save his leg. They paid for everything. The surgeries, the private room, the specialists flown in from Los Angeles and San Francisco, the experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. When the hospital administrator tried to present the bill, Wayne handed him a blank check and said, "Fill it in for whatever it takes." But the money was just the beginning. Dean Martin called Yvonne DiCarlo personally to tell her what had happened before she could hear it from anyone else. Then he arranged for a studio car to drive her and the boys to Tucson immediately. When she arrived at the hospital, terrified and crying, Dean was waiting in the lobby. He took her hands in his and said, "Your husband is going to be fine. And I don't mean maybe fine or hope he'll be fine. I mean Duke, and I are going to make sure he's fine. You hear me? You're not alone in this." They set up a hotel suite for Yvonne and the kids near the hospital, so they could be close to Bob. They paid for it. They arranged for meals to be delivered. They hired a nurse to help with the boys, so Yvonne could focus on her husband. When Yvonne protested that she couldn't possibly accept all this, that it was too much, Dean Martin looked at her and said something she never forgot. "Yvonne, your husband broke his body making my movie look good. The least I can do is make sure your family doesn't break while he heals." John Wayne did something even more remarkable. He went back to the set and gathered all the stuntmen together. What he said to them became legendary in the stunt community, passed down like gospel from one generation to the next. "Gentlemen," Wayne began, "what happened to Bob Morgan was nobody's fault, but it's everybody's responsibility. I've been making movies for 30 years, and I've seen too many good men go down and get left behind. That's ending today. From now on, any picture I'm on, if a stuntman gets hurt, we stop. We don't ask permission from the studio. We don't check the schedule. We stop and we take care of our people. And if any of you ever get hurt on one of my pictures, you come to me directly. You hear me? Not the stunt coordinator, not the assistant director. You come to me, and I will make sure you and your family are taken care of. That's not a promise. That's a guarantee." He paused and looked at every face in that circle. We're all in this together. The guy holding the boom mic is just as important as the guy with his name on the poster. Maybe more important, because he can't afford the same kind of insurance I can. So from this day forward, on any set I'm on, we look out for each other. Period. If the studio doesn't like it, they can find another Duke. But I guarantee you they won't, because they need me more than I need them. And I'm using that leverage for you. All of you. There are men in their 80s today who are on that set who still get emotional telling that story. The long road back. Bob Morgan's recovery was brutal. The initial prognosis was that he'd never walk normally again, let alone work as a stuntman. The damage to his leg was catastrophic. Multiple fractures, torn ligaments, a shattered kneecap, and nerve damage that made every step agony. The doctors wanted to amputate. Bob refused. He was in a fight for his leg, even if it meant months of excruciating rehabilitation. John Wayne and Dean Martin made sure he had every resource imaginable. They paid for experimental physical therapy. They brought in specialists from Europe who were pioneering new techniques in orthopedic recovery. They covered every medical bill, every therapy session, every consultation. When Bob's insurance ran out after 3 months, Wayne's accountant simply added Bob Morgan to his personal payroll as a technical consultant. so he'd have health coverage. But beyond the money, they gave him something even more valuable: their time and their respect. Dean Martin called Bob every single week during his recovery. Sometimes they'd talk for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Dean would tell him gossip from the set, make him laugh with stories about Wayne's terrible singing voice or Ricky Nelson's nervousness around the older stars. He'd ask about the boys, about Yvonne, about how Bob was feeling mentally and emotionally. He treated Bob like a friend, not a charity case. John Wayne visited whenever he was in Los Angeles. He'd show up at Bob's house unannounced with a bottle of whiskey and a deck of cards. They'd sit on Bob's back porch and play gin rummy from matchsticks, while Wayne told stories about the old days, and Bob slowly, painfully worked through his physical therapy exercises. Wayne never pitied him, never treated him like he was broken. He treated him like a fellow warrior who'd taken a hit and was getting back up. You know what separates a man from a quitter? Wayne said to Bob one afternoon, "A man knows that falling down is just part of the journey. A quitter thinks falling down is the end. You're no quitter, Bob. You're going to walk again. You're going to work again. And when you do, I want you on my next picture." Bob Morgan fought his way back. It took 18 months of rehabilitation that would have broken most men. He had to learn to walk again, literally from scratch, like a toddler. There were setbacks. There were infections. There were nights when the pain was so bad, he'd lie awake weeping. But every time he wanted to give up, he'd think about John Wayne's words. He'd remember Dean Martin's phone calls. He'd look at the pictures they'd sent, autographed with messages of encouragement. And somehow, impossibly, he made it back. The legacy that changed Hollywood. Bob Morgan returned to stunt work in 1960. His first job back was on a John Wayne film called The Alamo, which Wayne was directing himself. It wasn't a coincidence. Wayne had specifically created a position for Bob, a stunt that was challenging enough to prove Bob still had his skills, but safe enough that it wouldn't re-injure his leg. When Bob successfully completed the stunt, the entire crew erupted in applause. Wayne walked over, shook his hand, and said simply, "Welcome back, son." But the real impact of what Wayne and Martin did went far beyond one man's comeback. The incident on Rio Bravo became a turning point in how Hollywood treated its stunt performers. Wayne used his leverage as the biggest star in the business to push for better safety protocols. He refused to work on films that didn't have proper insurance coverage for stunt performers. He insisted that stunt coordinators have final say over whether a gag was safe to attempt. He became a one-man crusade for treating the invisible workers of Hollywood with dignity and respect. Other stars took notice. Steve McQueen, himself a former stuntman, followed Wayne's example. So did Burt Reynolds. So did countless others who saw that you could be a tough guy action hero and still care about the people who made your heroics possible. In 1961, the stunt community finally got organized and formed what would eventually become the Stuntmen's Association of Motion Pictures. One of the founding members was Bob Morgan, and at their first official meeting, they passed a resolution thanking John Wayne and Dean Martin for proving that stunt performers deserve the same respect as any other professional on a film set. The Screen Actors Guild began pushing for better safety regulations. Studios, facing pressure from their biggest stars, started implementing stricter protocols. It wasn't perfect. Stunts are still dangerous today, but it was progress. And that progress started because two men decided that no movie, no schedule, no amount of money was worth more than a human life. The truth they never publicized. Here's the part of the story that almost nobody knows. John Wayne and Dean Martin never talked about what they did for Bob Morgan. They never issued press releases. They never used it for publicity. They never brought it up in interviews. When reporters asked about the delay in Rio Bravo's production schedule, they deflected with jokes and vague references to technical difficulties. Bob Morgan tried to talk about it publicly once in the 1960s. He wanted the world to know what kind of men Wayne and Martin really were. Wayne called him personally and asked him not to. "Bob," Wayne said, "the minute this becomes a story, it becomes about me instead of about what's right. I don't want credit for doing what any decent human being should do. You don't get a medal for not being an asshole. Keep it between us. That way it stays pure." So Bob kept quiet for decades. It wasn't until after Wayne's death in 1979 and Martin's decline in the 1990s that he finally felt free to share the story. By then, he was in his 70s, working occasionally as a stunt coordinator, mentoring young performers and teaching them not just how to take a fall, but how to treat each other. Duke and Dean saved my life, Bob said in one of his final interviews before his own death in 1999. Not just my physical life, though they did that too. They saved me from bitterness. They saved me from feeling thrown away. They showed me that in this business, in this town where people will step over your body to get to the craft services table, there's still giants who remember what it means to be human. They didn't do it for publicity. They didn't do it for their image. They did it because it was right. And that, more than any movie they ever made, is why they were real heroes. What it all means. Rio Bravo went on to become one of the most beloved westerns ever made. It made a fortune at the box office. Critics praised it. Film students still study today as a masterclass in pacing, character development, and the western genre. Dean Martin's performance as Dude earned him some of the best reviews of his career and proved he was far more than just a crooner. John Wayne added another classic to his legendary filmography. But if you ask stunt performers from that era what they remember about Rio Bravo, they don't talk about the cinematography or the script or the performances. They talk about the day John Wayne stopped production. They talk about the precedent it set. They talk about how it changed the culture of film sets from that point forward. Because what Wayne and Martin did was revolutionary in the most fundamental way. They took a system that treated people as expendable and said, "No, not anymore. Not on our watch." They used their power not to get bigger trailers or more money or better billing. They used it to protect someone who had no power at all. They used it to say that a stuntman's life mattered just as much as a movie star's. In today's Hollywood, where every celebrity has a team managing their brand, calculating every public move for maximum impact, the idea that two massive stars would do something purely good and then refuse to publicize it seems almost impossible to believe. But that's exactly what happened. Because John Wayne and Dean Martin came from a different era. An era that believed character was what you did when nobody was watching. Heroism was helping someone who couldn't help you back. Integrity was doing the right thing even when it cost you something. They stopped Rio Bravo for Bob Morgan. But in doing so, they started something much bigger. They started a movement toward treating every person on a film set with dignity. They started a conversation about responsibility and care that continues today. They proved that even in the dream factory, even in the machine of Hollywood, humanity could still triumph. The last word. Bob Morgan lived until 1999. He worked as a stuntman and stunt coordinator for another 30 years after his accident. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But he walked. He provided for his family. He saw his boys grow up. He had a career and a life that every doctor said was impossible. And every single year on the anniversary of his accident, he'd get two things in the mail. A card from John Wayne, and after Wayne's death, from Wayne's children. And a phone call from Dean Martin. And after Martin couldn't dial anymore, a card from his family. Neither man ever forgot him. Neither man ever let him forget that he mattered. That's the real story of Rio Bravo. Not the movie that made millions. Not the performances that earned praise. But the moment when two legends looked at a broken man in the dirt and decided that he was worth more than any film could ever be. When you watch Rio Bravo today, watch it with different eyes. When you see John Wayne share a John T. Chance, remember that the man playing him was the kind of person who would halt a major motion picture for a stuntman's broken leg. When you see Dean Martin's Dude, struggling with alcoholism and fighting for redemption, remember that the actor bringing him to life was the kind of man who sat in a hospital for 2 days with a family he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. The Western genre is full of myths about heroes who face down outlaws, who stand up for the weak, who never back down from doing what's right no matter the cost. John Wayne and Dean Martin spent their careers playing those heroes. But on a dusty afternoon in Arizona in 1958, they stopped playing and became the real thing. And that, more than any Oscar or box office record or place in film history, is why their legacy endures. Because when it mattered most, When the cameras weren't rolling and nobody was watching, they chose humanity over Hollywood. They stopped Rio Bravo. And in doing so, they showed us all what it really means to be a hero.